and that we're also making sure to mute everyone. If you haven't had a chance, our facilitator will be muting you. So in the bottom left, you'll see the mute button, but if it hasn't been clicked, please click on that. So we're going to be recording this, and we just really want to thank you for your participation. There'll be a series of these webinars, and we'll be posting the date for the future one. But let me give you a little bit of introduction to our presenter. Mary brings tremendous expertise in this area. If you read her bio, she's been involved in education for 37 years in a range of roles. What I love is she brings classroom practice from the practitioner in the classroom in special education. She spent 16 years as a principal. She really brings deep knowledge of classroom practice. She played a real leadership role. I want to make sure that you mute your button there if you haven't muted it. But she brings leadership role in the areas of social and emotional learning. She was a gubernatorial appointment board of the Illinois Children's Mental Health Partnership, and she also co-chaired the School Policies and Standards Subcommittee for 6 years. So this work that you see presented today that Mary is really kind of leading in the design of, she really has deep knowledge both as a classroom practice, as an instructional leader, and in academic and scholarly work. She does a lot of presentations in this area. So we're really excited to have her leadership in this presentation here. So just a few housekeeping items. If you haven't, you might want to roll your cursor down in the bottom right. You'll see a chat button. We have someone who's going to be monitoring the chat space. We're going to hold the questions till towards the end. We've saved about 15-20 minutes for questions. But we're monitoring the chat space there, so please feel free to both introduce yourself and put in the chat space. And also just a reminder, you want to keep yourself on mute. If you forget, we've got someone facilitating in the background. And then the last thing, if you see videos up on your screen, ideally you see me and you see Mary there, but you can change the option. If you click on the top right, you can focus just on having the speaker view. So everyone else, we've got about 25, 26 participants right now and more joining. You can eliminate them by just clicking on the large show the active speaker button. So Mary, I want to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for doing this. And I'm going to hand the mic off to you now.
Thanks, Kaylani. I'm happy to be here with everyone this afternoon and hope to share with you some of the things that are going on in the field of social emotional learning across the nation, across the world. Social emotional learning is a rapidly growing field of study. We'll talk about some of that as we go through things today. As Kaylani said, please make sure to have your chat box open because we're going to have a few interactive activities where you'll be entering your thinking into the chat box. Because everyone is muted, but your fingers are going to do the talking for you today. So have your chat box open and be ready to share your thinking. And especially if you have questions as we go, please share those as well. What we hope to accomplish today is to really figure out what do we mean when we talk about social emotional learning. People have different ideas about what it might mean. We'll take a look at what the accepted definition is. We'll talk about some of the research that's related to social emotional learning. We'll talk about what competencies we build when we work in that field, and we'll consider ways that teachers can build those competencies directly in their classrooms. So we're talking about everyone from pre-K through high school and beyond when we talk about social emotional learning. And a lot of what I'll share with you today is information that's been gathered from an organization called the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Their acronym is CASEL, C-A-S-E-L, and they are the highly regarded research arm of social emotional learning, where they do research on their own as well as gather it and serve large urban districts through a collaborating district initiative. But a lot of what they've shared with us is something important that we're going to be talking about today. And the first thing I want to share with you is their definition, and it is the accepted one that people use across the country, of social emotional learning. Would you take a moment and just read that to yourself? Now I'd like you to think about, if you had a highlighter, what words would you highlight while you were reading this definition? And since you don't have a highlighter, instead you have a chat box, would you enter just a word or a phrase or two that stuck out for you as you read this definition? Thanks. If you haven't had a chance to type in a word or two, please feel free. But a few of them stood out for a lot of you. I saw the word empathy show up a lot. And isn't that something that we are all hoping we can develop more of in our students as they grow into adulthood? But there were a few others that came up as well. We had people bringing up things about managing emotions, about understanding emotions, about relationships. And I saw a few people put in the word process, as well as someone who put in the word children and adults. I think that's an interesting thing to note. When we're talking about social emotional learning, we really are talking about a process. It's not something that is static, that you learn and there you have it. We are all in process. I know I can speak for myself that I am in process. There are some social emotional skills that I'm still working on. All of us are, if we have some self-awareness, but that it's for children, it is for adults, and it is something that takes a while to understand, manage, apply all of these sorts of skills that we're talking about. So as we go through the day, this is going to be the definition we're going to think of, and we're going to think about it in this ongoing way for children and adults. You know, SEL is a strong field of study right now. Some people, for a while, maybe you've heard this, thought that social emotional skills were fluff, the kinds of things that you do if you have time. Maybe, you know, well, if we'll have time, we'll work on it, but it's far more important that we bring up our academics. That sort of thing, perhaps you've heard. But when we take a look at the research, we're going to see that it isn't fluff. It's actual science. And we now know that it's brain science. And we'll talk a little bit about how some of that work has developed. You remember CASEL, our Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. They, along with a group of other researchers, did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago that is really considered the seminal piece of research regarding social emotional learning. They looked at 213 studies around schools that were implementing SEL with fidelity in their schools, and they looked at the results that they achieved. And this was a major study. We're talking about, it encompassed over 270,000 students, and it was from students of all settings, rural, suburban, and urban, of all ethnicities, socioeconomics. It was a big study. Well done. And the results really affirm what we've hoped to learn about SEL. So if you take a look here, on the student gain side, they saw an increase in social emotional skills, which is what you'd hope for if you're implementing social emotional learning with fidelity. But they saw that. They saw students reporting an improved attitude about themselves, about others, and about their school. And if you know about the research regarding school bondedness, school connectedness, you know that that's an important aspect. They saw an increase in positive classroom behavior. And they found that there was, on average, an 11 percentile point gain on standardized achievement test. Now, think about that. We were looking at schools implementing social emotional learning, and what they ended up finding was this 11 percentile point gain on standardized achievement test. So I'm going to ask you to enter some thinking into the chat box. I'd like you to hypothesize why. Why, if schools are implementing social emotional learning, are they getting an increase in their academic achievement? Would you enter your guess, your thought, your supposition into the chat box? someone asked to repeat the question. The question was why people might have thought that we had this game in academics when we were implementing social emotional learning. As you can see, lots of our friends who are on the chat box have talked about a lot of things, that there are fewer disruptions. Children have more self-confidence. There's more engagement in learning. When children feel safe, they're willing to take the risk that kids need to make that growth in academics. And that focus on clarity on behaviors. So the emotion, learning is an emotional thing. And if we don't tend to the emotions, then we're not going to have the benefit of learning. And think about when kids are struggling with their emotions, they aren't available to learn, whether that's because they've had a conflict in the hallway on their way to class, a problem during the class that preceded theirs, perhaps an issue on the playground with another student. If kids don't learn to address what they're feeling and learn how to solve some of the problems that they're experiencing, all the math lesson you have planned isn't going to make a bit of difference. So it is using everything that we know about students that builds this social emotional skill that also creates an increase in their academic performance. And this meta-analysis did show us that there was a reduction in that risk for failure, aggressive behavior, emotional distress, all the things that we want to reduce so that children can be available to learn were part of that study. I want to share another study with you, and I love this study because it takes a look, the long-term look at students. In fact, a very long-term. Back in about 1991, Mark Greenberg and some of his colleagues took a look at 753 kindergarten students. And they assessed how they did on what I think of as, remember the old book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? I bet some of you kindergarten teachers know that. Well, that they looked at students and they observed them, they had teachers give ratings, talk to the children themselves about the things that you see on the screen. And they followed those kids. They followed them for 20 years until those 5-year-olds were 25. And what they found was that students who scored well when they were in kindergarten were 4 times as likely to get a college degree by the age of 25 as those who didn't score well. And they were more likely to have a full-time job, which is really, from a parental view, what you're hoping for. But that's what we hope is that level of success for all of our students. They also found that students who didn't score well and had no interventions were more likely to have negative interactions with police. They had less economic success. They had issues of drug abuse and alcohol abuse. So we know that children who have these strong SEL skills are going to have a better chance of success in the world. And it doesn't mean that if they don't have them when they're 5, that they're doomed. It just behooves all of us as educators to figure out ways in which we can offer the development of social emotional competencies and skills to the students in our classrooms every day. And just one more quick study that somewhat related to this one from the American Journal of Public Health was a cost-benefit analysis that was done. And it was found that for every $1 that schools invested in social emotional learning, whether that money was going to pay teachers, to pay for programming, and so on, that there was an $11 payoff. And not that we should be doing this for the money, but sometimes when people think, when they're talking about these soft skills, we're really talking about a payoff in the long run, because students who have these strong SEL skills are far less likely to need more support as an adult. They are more likely to be able to manage their problems themselves. There's been so much going on with social emotional learning lately that there's actually been a national commission formed. The Aspen Institute, which is a nonpartisan research organization has developed a national commission on social, emotional, and academic development. And I have to tell you, being a little bit of an SEL groupie myself, when I looked at the list of who was on this commission, I was overwhelmed. It really is. It's the names, the big names in research around all learning, around research around social emotional learning, around the neuroscience of learning. So these are the best folks that we could possibly have. And in addition to that, they have practitioners who are working with them. So there's a lot happening here at the National Commission at the Aspen Institute. And they recently came out with a white paper, an evidence base for how we learn, and that the support there for learning based on support for social emotional learning was significant. They stated that the major domains of human development, social, emotional, cognitive, linguistic, and academic are all deeply intertwined in the brain, in behavior, and that they're all central to learning. They reported that this matters. This matters for all kinds of learning. They reported that you can teach social and emotional skills. And I guess we've always known that, but it's good to have that shown to us through the research, that these skills are something that can be taught, and that these social emotional skills do play a big role. Just as you talked about when we looked at that 11 percentile point increase in academic achievement, all of that plays a role so that we know. And we also have an $11 cost benefit on making SEL development worth it. So all of that, this was great supportive information from the National Commission. So let's get down to it. What is it that we're talking about? What kinds of skills do we want our children to learn when we're talking about social emotional learning? CASEL has declared that there are 5 interrelated competency areas that are essential to cognitive, social, and emotional development. And you can see them here. 2 of them are the intrapersonal ones, self-management and self-awareness. 2 of them are interpersonal ones, social awareness and relationship skills. And then finally, there's responsible decision-making, which when you think about it, really encompasses all of these as well. So all of these are what we want to deal with when we're working with our students. And let's not forget that SEL is a process. And so we have to remember our own competencies as teachers, as adults, as we are working with our schools and helping them to foster these skills in students. I'd like to break down each one of these just a little bit so that we can understand it. So let's take a look here at self-awareness. Listed under the heading of self-awareness, I have a few bullet points. And those are some bullet points that came from the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, which is an organization that's affiliated with the American Institute of Research. They have some wonderful free resources on their website. And I would encourage you to take a look at them. And they've listed some of what, sort of operationalizing some of these competencies, and you can see them there. So it's not an inclusive list. There are other things that you might put under self-awareness, but in general, we know that self-awareness is the ability to accurately recognize our own feelings and thoughts and how those influence our own behavior, how we can assess our own strengths and our weaknesses, what our thoughts and beliefs are, and have a growth mindset, that grounded sense of optimism and self-efficacy that will help us as we work our way through life. The second competency is self-management. Take a look at those bullet points. Self-management is the ability to regulate your own emotions and behaviors and cognition in different situations. Lots of times when we think about self-management, teachers automatically think about, oh, they can control their behavior. Well, that's part of it, but I think the more interesting one is the ability to have self-management to set goals and make plans on how to achieve those goals, how to delay gratification or manage stress and control your impulses. Self-management's really the key facilitator to all the learning, whether it's an academic subject or whether it's something like learning to play a musical instrument or learn how to play a sport. it allows us to follow through on our plans and reach the goals that we have for learning. Social awareness. A lot of you had mentioned empathy when we were listing what stuck out to us in our definition, but social awareness is that ability to take the perspective of others and really empathize with others, whether they're like us or from diverse backgrounds and cultures, and to understand what are the social and ethical norms for our behavior. And to be able to seek help when we need it, to know what family or community resources or resources within the school might help us. Research suggests that students with strong social awareness can adapt more easily to their learning environment and empathize with others, whether that's being a character in a book or the child that's sitting next to them. Excuse me. And findings also suggest that students who have this strong social awareness can really engage in deeper communication with others. And you know how much collaboration we're building into our schools these days, because that's what our standards are telling us we need to do, and that's what best practice is telling us we need to do. But that's where social awareness really comes into play in the classroom. Relationship skills. Relationship skills are how children get along with one another, how we all get along together, and how we can maintain those healthy relationships with diverse individuals and groups. Again, we have communication here, knowing how to constructively negotiate conflict. Because lots of times people think, oh, SEL, you're just trying to get kids, can't we all just get along? Well, we know we can't. We can't always all just get along. So how do we manage that? How do we negotiate what we need to do with each other and learn how to compromise? Learn when we do need to stand up for ourselves. When do we need to be persuasive or assertive? All of those things come into our daily lives. And, you know, it's an area a lot of us are working on. And right now it feels like we could use a little bit more of it. But those relationship skills are significant for learning as well. And finally, our last competency is responsible decision making. So if we want kids to make responsible decisions, we have to remember to offer them the opportunity to do that. So how much opportunity do you give your students to have a voice and to make choices in the classroom and assess how those are happening? So by offering a little more autonomy in the classroom and letting children have some reflection time to see how did their decisions turn out, so that they can reflect on their own thinking, their own actions, and use their social awareness to understand the impact that those might have on others. So as you can see, these 5 competencies are pretty massive, pretty significant, and very much related to the kind of learning that might be taking place in classrooms. CASEL has also taken these 5 competencies and they put them in some context of how and where children need to learn them. And so if you take a look at these circles that encompass the competencies, the first one is in our classrooms, where we need to use some SEL curriculum and instruction. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can bring SEL to your classroom in just a few minutes. But they also ask that we take a look school-wide and what are the practices and policies that you have in place that might be building on those competencies. And we know that no one teaches alone. None of our children live in isolation. So we need family and community partnerships in order to maintain the SEL skills that we're trying to develop. So let's talk for a minute about how we can teach SEL in our classrooms. What are some things that you can do to make social emotional learning come alive wherever you are in school? The first thing we want to think about is the development of a positive learning environment, because everybody works better when things feel good. And that positive learning environment is something that you can do, that you can set up without spending any money, but with really thinking very intentionally about your practices. One thing is what we talked about with responsible decision making, to offer students a voice. It doesn't matter if they're 4 or 5 or if they're 17 or 18, they all have a voice. They all have an opinion. And if we can ask them to share that and learn how to communicate that with each other, we've given them an investment. Someone mentioned engagement. We've given them an investment in what's happening in the classroom. That gives us a positive environment. Allowing the children to set norms. And I don't, rules are great. And some rules are ones that we might have students engage in. And some rules are ones that we just have to tell them. Somebody had to make the decision that this is the door we're going to enter to go into school. That's a rule. But there are norms that they can set. Norms where they can decide, how are we going to treat each other? How are we going to be together? How do we include everyone? So having them set those norms, what they expect of each other and what they expect of themselves. And you're sharing with them the clear and positive expectations that they need to be successful at school. And finally, modeling. There's very little that's more powerful in social emotional learning than modeling. These days, it seems like everyone has a camera. We all have one on our phone. But when I think of our students, well, they don't have cameras in their classrooms, I hope. Some of them might. But they do. They all have a little GoPro camera. It's invisible. It's attached to the top of their head, and they are recording everything that you are doing, everything you are saying. Your modeling is significant. How you respond to the student who got the answer wrong. How do you respond to the student who's disrupting the class? How do you interact with your colleagues? Because believe me, are they watching? They see you. And that modeling is one of the most powerful things that you can plan on doing to have a positive learning environment. Another way that we can address SEL in the classroom is through the direct instruction of SEL skills. And there's lots of ways that you can approach this. CASEL has given us an acronym because we love acronyms in education. But what they say about teaching SEL is that it should be safe. And here's what that means. It means your instruction needs to be sequenced. You have to have an intentional plan and follow through with that. It needs to be active in that the students are actively engaged in creating this knowledge, a constructive approach to learning social emotional skills. It needs to be focused. There does have to be time when you take the time out to really focus and have conversations with students about how they're learning to manage themselves, how they are developing empathy. And it needs to deal with explicitly targeted SEL skills. So when we think of this SAFE acronym, we're thinking about instruction. We can do that ourselves, but there are many evidence-based programs out there that you can use as well. And if you're interested in exploring more about evidence-based social emotional learning programming for it, you can go to the CASEL website, casel.org. They have a guide that takes all the evidence-based programs, the highly researched programs, and it doesn't rate them in like, this is the best and don't use this one, but it rates them according to the kind of instruction that's being offered and how the program has worked and what it covers. So they have a preschool and elementary version, and they have a middle and high school version, and I would encourage you to look there if you're interested. There's also another recent publication that has come out that's called Navigating Schools from the Inside Out, and it's written by Stephanie Jones and some of her colleagues from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And there's a review of 25 programs at the elementary level. They haven't done their middle and high school review yet, but that's a place where you can find out some information about that. Let's talk about how you might integrate social emotional learning with the academic content that you're doing every day. I'm going to ask you to interact with us in the chat box again. So let's take a look here. I want you to look at this standard. This is sort of a common standard. You can fill in the blank there for the grade that you'd be doing. And I want you to think for a minute. what social emotional skills might students need to succeed with this standard? It's an ELA standard. But go ahead, just jot in the chat box what SEL skills you might think students would need to be successful here. Lots of things about communication, listening, respect for others, taking turns, positively disagreeing. There's a lot there, isn't it? So that little ELA standard that we have is pretty juicy in the SEL world. There's a lot there that you might need to think about building with students as you are doing this work. So, for instance, if you had a book talk with a partner and they were going to have this conversation, think of all the things that you've listed here, the social awareness they would need and how they were going to have that conversation. So, how might you do this? Well, a couple of suggestions that I might offer is that you might set academic and social goals for your instruction. So if your academic goal is this book talk, and you might be talking about, say, how did my character show growth in the book that I was reading? And you're going to let them know that's the academic goal. That's what they're going to be discussing with each other. But let's talk about what our social goal might be. And I might pick one of the ones that somebody has listed here, and it might be about relationship skills and communication. I might say, let's make our goal today to show our partner how we're listening to their discussion. And then you might talk just briefly about what does that look like? What does it sound like? And it might be different depending with your little ones. You might talk about whole body listening and turning to look at them. You might also talk about, do you smile? Do you ask follow-up questions? And so in a few minutes, you've set goals. You've set an academic goal and you've set a social goal, and you set them about their business. And you walk around and you listen in on their conversations, and you might offer them feedback about their thinking about this piece of literature, along with their academic or their social goal that they were attending to. And at the end of the lesson, you're going to reflect. How did we do? Did you learn about the way your character changed, your partner's character changed? And how did we do with listening? How did we do with showing respect to our partner? How many follow-up questions were you able to think of? Things like that. So now you've integrated social emotional learning with academic content. You didn't have to take time out for this lesson. You had to take a couple of minutes to set it up and to reflect on it. You know, a case study by the Aspen Institute has just come out, and they have a couple of wonderful programs that they've listed that have the social emotional component built right in. One is at the upper grade level is Facing History and Ourselves, where the students take up something that's happened in history and really go deeply into it and talk about the ramifications of decisions that were made and were they responsible, and they build on their SEL skills that way. Another program that the Aspen Institute mentioned was from the Center for the Collaborative Classroom, where they have literacy programming, where every lesson has a social and an academic focus built right into it. By embedding SEL into the instruction, it looks like the research is telling us we're getting the biggest bang for our buck, where we're getting those academic skills learned, but we're building the social emotional skills into them. It doesn't feel like we're in isolation. They're merged. One other thing that I'd like to talk to you about are some general teaching practices that support social emotional development. This comes from that Center on Great Teachers and Leaders that I told you about. And they've taken a look at some teaching practices, things that you do every day that are going to help build social emotional competencies. And they've divided them into two groups. One are the social kinds of practices, sort of the how we teach practices. whether it is student-centered discipline that really helps students understand when they are done, when they've made an error and how they might correct it, or something like using teacher language that builds that growth mindset, that builds that desire for children to achieve more, along with the responsibility and choice and warmth and support. What I find very interesting about these is that if you do a correlation with these, with John Hattie's research on visible learning, you're going to see these are highly correlated with the pieces that he found had most impact. Same thing is true with some of these instructional practices that we might want to develop in our classroom. These practices like cooperative learning. There's, oh my goodness, think of what you can accomplish in the social emotional realm with cooperative learning. It's such a huge piece. We could spend our entire webinar today just talking about that and how it works. But even classroom discussions and who has the voice in the classroom? Who's doing the talking? Who's doing the work? Should be the kids. Because those classroom discussions can be very powerful, and they can be powerful social emotional tools as well, as do all of the rest of these. So really some great work here. This is from the Teaching the Whole Child piece that was put out by our AIR friends. And so when you take a look at all of these skills that we've talked about, this development of a positive learning environment, the direct instruction of SEL skills, integrating SEL with academic content, and just developing some general teaching practices for the development and application of them, you can see that they're all things that with a little intentionality, some little tweaks to the way you do school, you can help kids do school in a way that's helping that intertwined learning, that what's happening in their brain of correlating the academics with the social emotional piece. I just want to touch briefly on a few other things. We had talked a little bit about this context that Castle had given us. And so when we talk about these processes that need to happen school-wide, you really might want to think about what do you have going on across your day and look at it through the lens of the 5 competencies that you see there and see what are you doing to build up more of this, whether it's in the lunchroom, in the hallways, in how you do assemblies. There are many ways that you can build these SEL competencies by looking at your policies and practices, particularly in the area of student discipline. And then you want to think about that great beyond. We know that our students spend 6-7 hours a day with us, but that the rest of the time they're out with their family and learning there. So what kinds of partnerships do we need to engage in from school to home and beyond the home for communication to extend this learning? What do parents know about social emotional learning? You know, as a parent myself, I kind of thought, well, okay, that's my job. But I sure wish they'd work on it at school, because that's where my child's with all these other kids and they can practice these things. So it isn't just my job, it's all of our jobs. And how do we engage our families and bring them into the school to learn with us for the sake of their students? Another way that we go beyond the classroom is through standards. And if you take a look at our map here, the shaded in states are states that have developed social emotional learning standards. As you can see, there aren't a lot of them. Now, I could say this though, because I know that a lot of you are early literacy teachers. Almost all of our states have something for preschool. They build the SEL standards in at the preschool level and forget about everybody once they hit first grade. So these states have standards that cover pre-K through 12 or K through 12. And I just want to share with you an example, because I'm very proudly from the state of Illinois, where we were first in the nation with developing social emotional learning standards. And I want to show you what they are, because you can see by knowing the competencies, you already know the Illinois state standards for social emotional learning, because you can see how they are written with the competencies in mind. So when our very brilliant state developed these, in addition to just having these goals, they've laid out how these standards look across the grades and across the ages. And I'm showing you this just so that you can see an example. And I'd encourage you to go to our State Board of Education website, isbe.net, and take a look at how these are written. I know that there are many schools across the country in states that didn't have their own standards who used the Illinois standards as a model to develop their own. So just a little something there for you to think about. So we're going to have time for some questions in just a minute. If you would start thinking about what you might like to chat about. But I want to end sort of the formal part of our presentation with this quote. It comes from a gentleman by the name of Lyon Terry. He was the Washington State Teacher of the Year, and he wrote a blog that I read just last week. And man, did this just hit home with me. Take a look at what he wrote. So I couldn't agree with Lyon more that if we don't teach the heart, we can't reach the mind, because, you know, it is connected. And now we have the science to show that all of that learning, whether it's social or academic, comes together in the brain. So let's talk for a minute. What do you wonder about? What questions do you have? And what would you like to learn next? So we've got a question here about post-secondary predictors and whether there's a relationship with SEL and persistence and completion. And I'm going to be honest with you that I don't have that research right here to tell you what that would look like, but I'd certainly be interested in sharing some information with you when I could give you some research about that. Here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that there was an effect. There was a study done that when students left a school where there was social emotional programming that was being implemented with fidelity, that they had a 3.75 year continuation of that. I know at the elementary school I was at, we always worried, well, what's going to happen to these kids when they go to the high school and they don't have this kind of work? Well, they were going to walk into the high school pretty much with that well in hand. So I can't say, I don't know about if that impact was tracked through post-secondary time, but I do know that we do know there's a long-term benefit with that. I'm asked for some curricular recommendations, and I'm not the person to ask. I could give you my own personal views, but I'd rather not. I can tell you this. Let's talk elementary first. At the elementary, there are different kinds of social emotional learning programs. Some of them are skills-based, and they take a social emotional skill and they teach it to students in isolation. They have some sort of methodology for teaching it. And then the students practice applying it. Others are more community-based, where they are looking at building a sense of community in the school and building from that, drawing out the social emotional competencies. So could I recommend one to you offline? But really what I think you need is to look at the Castle website, take a look at the Castle Guide, and see what you're trying to accomplish. Are you looking for a specific skills program or more of a community building one? Do you want something that brings parents in with the program, or is that something that's not important to you? Do you want something that will help you integrate into academics or not? So look at the Castle Guide for that, or that document from Stephanie Jones, Navigating SEL from the Inside Out. As far as the middle level, man, do we have work to do. We have work to do at the middle and high school level. There isn't a lot of well-researched social emotional learning programming available at the upper grades. There's some. The Aspen Institute reported, as I mentioned, Facing History and Ourselves. That is something that is a middle school program, but could I recommend it to you? Not mine to do. But I would, again, Castle does have that guide that would help you with that. Question about which integrates academics better, skill-based or community-based? Could I tell you that I think it's teacher-based? Because I think a teacher who is aware and intentional about their instruction can take the skills and merge them into academics and do the same thing with the community-based work. I've had a conversation years ago with Roger Weisberg, who is the Chief Knowledge Officer at Castle, about which comes first, the community or the skills. And we decided neither of us could answer that question, and it's the school that has to determine it. The schools have to know what they need. Alfie Kohn warns us to be careful if we stifle conflict in the classroom. So what skills do we need to do the SEL without hindering students from speaking their opinion? I think we have to be willing to allow them to do that and teach them how to do that respectfully. Because, you know, Alfie Kohn is such an interesting author. I swear, every time I read something he's written, I'm going, yes, 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 no, no, no. He always incites deep critical thinking, if nothing else. But I agree with him on this. We do have to teach children how to disagree, because if they don't, they will never learn how. They will never learn how to tell someone, I think you're wrong, or I didn't like what you just did. And those are social emotional competencies. If you noticed, being assertive or persuasive is one of those things that come under our headings of our competencies. So I think we do it. But I think that students just have to learn that they have a voice, and their voice will be heard if it's a respectful one, and one that takes into consideration, takes the perspective of others. So looking at the competencies and what's necessary as we apply them to that kind of conflict, and teaching children, you know, how to have conversations around academic topics about which they might have disagreement can also be very helpful when it comes to having a conversation about personal things. So they might have learned some ways to respectfully disagree and to give their reasons for their thinking. That's what we want them to do with academics as well as in the social realm. So we've heard about some of the curricula that some of the schools are using. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about, or that you wonder about, or that you'd like to know more about? Literature recommendations and PD ideas for staff. In a minute, I'll share with you a couple of resources and good places to learn. There's so much coming out right now. I would urge you to go to the Aspen Institute and download their white paper and take a look at their case study, because I think that has some very good information in it. PD ideas, I think introducing your staff to the SEL competencies and what that looks like, and thinking first of themselves before they start applying them to their students is an interesting professional development idea. The Castle website has an entire layout of how a school or a district might begin to implement social emotional learning. And one of the first things they recommend is just building some understanding and some insights into what they need, and doing some sort of a needs assessment. I know that at the school where I was principal for many years, we started our work with a needs assessment, and I have to tell you, it was a little bit of a shock to us. We had a pretty good school that performed pretty well. And when we asked our students what they thought, we were amazed at how they felt. They needed more. They needed more in the way of respect, in the way of relationships, and the way of making connections to one another and to their teachers. And that guided our work. So I would encourage you, as you're getting started, if you want to start this journey, that would be a good place to go. But let me tell you just a couple of other places you might look. So I've given you the Castle website. this Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, where I've used some of their information today. But what I love about them is that they have public domain PD available to you. So take a look at that. Go to this website, and if you go, just search social and emotional learning, and there are pieces there where teachers can take their own assessments of themselves. It gives you some ideas of professional learning experiences that you could offer to your staff. So it's a very useful website with lots of things that you could do. They do have a lot of topics that they cover, but social emotional learning is a big one. Then I've given you, and I see that Brett's put it in our chat box as well, the link to the National Commission. And finally, Edutopia, which we really haven't talked about a lot this afternoon, but Edutopia is a wonderful resource. They do a lot of work on project-based learning and social emotional learning. And boy, do those two mesh well. But you can look on the Edutopia website and find wonderful videos that you can share with yourself that might be topics of conversation. You can also find resources. They have a lot of lovely blogs that you can find there. And so I would encourage you to take a look there. I will say this, it feels like social emotional learning is really coming into its own right now. It's everywhere. When I started learning about it back in the mid-90s, there were very few programs and there was very little research. And now it's pretty easy to find lots and lots of good information out there. So look around, see what you can find. Look at everything through the lens of those 5 competencies and see what it will do to help you and your students. Does anybody have any wonderings or things that you would like to learn more about in addition to what you've already entered into the chat box? Well, as we are having our time coming up to a close here, a couple of things that I'd like to help make you aware of. Here is my email address, and I'm certainly happy to engage with you in any kind of conversation. You can also contact the Consortium for Educational Change, where we'd be happy to help you with things that you may need. And we also have here Kaylani's email and contact information, and I know that she would be happy to engage with you as well.
And I wanted to just let people know, part of this partnership and working with Mary and with the Consortium for Educational Change is to develop a set of professional development resources around this topic that will be made free and available probably by the middle of October. They'll be both on the LOSI website as well as linked and made available through the CEC website. But it's designed around a PLC, professional learning community structure, where there'll be 8 sessions, about 45 minutes to an hour each one, with a facilitator's guide, and really linked to both webinars like this, but short video clips. There'll be articles, some cases. So there'll be 8 weeks of content to support a school-based PLC conversation around this topic. This was supported by this grant project, but CEC is really leading the development of it. And this webinar is going to be part of that series. So thank you so much, Mary. Is there anything else you want to add? You're a tremendous presenter. Doesn't she do like great wait time as well with this? Mary, you've done a marvelous job. Is there anything else you want to add, Mary?
I don't think so at this time, but it's been such an honor to do this and to have folks online interact with us. And thank you, Kaylani, for joining with us at CEC to offer this. I'm very excited about the work and hope that everyone will be able to walk away with something they can use today.
Great. And this, we have recorded this, so this webinar will be up within the next week or so as well. So that will be available as well. So thank you very much. And I guess if there's nothing further, we'll end it. Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.